episode 82, titled Specialized Systems, OT, NFC, RFID, Bluetooth, we move away from general-purpose endpoints and into environments where constraints shape the risk more than raw compute power ever could. These systems often sit at the boundary between the digital world and physical outcomes, so small security mistakes can have outsized consequences. What makes them specialized is not that they are exotic, but that they are built for narrow missions with tight tolerances for disruption and change. Many were designed for longevity, predictable behavior, and simple user experiences, not for rapid patch cycles or deep security instrumentation. The goal here is to understand how those constraints influence both attacker behavior and the safe, professional way to assess and mitigate risk.
A good starting point is to recognize that specialized systems tend to be constrained in multiple dimensions at once, including processing headroom, energy budget, network bandwidth, and human operational capacity. Those constraints lead designers to simplify protocols, reduce cryptography, or rely on static identifiers because it works in the field. Over time, that simplification becomes an attacker's advantage because predictable patterns are easier to copy, replay, or spoof. At the same time, defenders have fewer opportunities to make disruptive improvements because replacement cycles can be measured in years. This is why your thinking has to be systems-oriented rather than tool-oriented, especially when you are trying to reason like a Pen Test Plus candidate.
If you can explain how constraints lead to specific classes of weakness, you can assess the risk without guessing or overreaching.
OT is the clearest example of why constraints matter, because safety and uptime typically outweigh aggressive testing in the priority stack. In these environments, availability is not just a service-level goal, it can be a safety requirement tied to physical process stability. That reality changes the acceptable testing posture because even routine activity in other networks can cause unexpected load, alarms, or fail-safe behavior in OT devices. Owners may also accept known vulnerabilities when patching or rebooting would create unacceptable operational uncertainty, which can look strange if you are thinking only in enterprise IT terms. A professional approach is to treat stability as a first-class requirement and to frame findings in terms of operational impact, not just technical defect. When you keep that in mind, your assessment becomes credible and useful instead of technically correct but operationally unsafe.
The way OT is built also changes how adversaries behave, because attackers can exploit the friction defenders face around change management and maintenance windows. A weakness that would be quickly patched on a laptop might persist for years in an industrial environment, so attackers can plan and return repeatedly. You also see more reliance on segmentation, monitoring, and procedural controls because technical hardening may be limited by vendor support and certification requirements. That means a security recommendation that ignores operations can be rejected even if it is best practice, simply because it increases downtime risk. In an exam setting, what matters is your ability to recognize those constraints and adjust your expectations accordingly. In real work, that same mindset keeps you from causing harm while still producing meaningful risk reduction.
NFC and RFID are easier to describe on the surface, but they carry a deceptively important role because they often represent identity signals that drive access decisions. NFC is typically used for very short-range interactions, such as tapping a card or device to a reader, and it often powers quick authentication-like experiences. RFID is broader and can span many use cases, from building badges and asset tags to logistics and inventory tracking, and the range and protocol details vary by implementation. In both cases, the system frequently treats a presented value as proof that a person or object should be trusted. Because the interaction feels physical and local, stakeholders sometimes assume the channel is inherently secure, even when the data is simple and repeatable. A strong assessment stance is to treat these technologies as communication and verification mechanisms, not as magical trust devices. Common NFC and RFID risks concentrate around cloning, weak authentication, and replay. And these ideas come up repeatedly because they are so practical for an attacker. Cloning occurs when an attacker captures an identifier or credential-like value and reproduces it on another token, creating a functional duplicate. Weak authentication shows up when the system trusts the identifier itself rather than validating cryptographic evidence or additional context that proves the identifier is legitimate right now. Replay is the subtle cousin of cloning, where the attacker records a valid exchange and repeats it later, exploiting a lack of freshness checks like nonces or time binding. The unifying theme is that static values are not identity, they are just data, and data can be copied. When you see a system that acts on a static identifier, you should immediately ask what prevents duplication and what the system does to detect suspicious reuse.
Bluetooth brings a different set of risk patterns because it is designed for flexible connectivity, frequent discovery, and quick pairing, often in crowded environments.
Weak pairing practices remain a core concern, especially when devices use legacy modes, predictable codes, or user workflows that encourage accepting prompts without verification.
Device discovery is another recurring problem, because discoverable devices advertise their presence and often reveal services, device types, or metadata that helps an attacker target them. Spoofing behavior also matters because names, classes, and identifiers can be imitated, and users tend to trust what looks familiar even when it is not authentic. Even when encryption exists, encryption is only as good as the trust establishment that created the connection in the first place.
When you evaluate Bluetooth risk, you are effectively evaluating how trust is formed, how identity is conveyed, and how easily an attacker can impersonate or observe.
Privacy concerns cut across OT, NFC, RFID, and Bluetooth because wireless identifiers can become passive tracking beacons even when no one is actively attacking in the traditional sense.
Devices and tags may broadcast stable identifiers or metadata that lets observers correlate presence over time, revealing patterns about people, teams, or operational activity. In corporate environments, that can expose who is present, when certain roles arrive, or where high-value operations occur based purely on observed signals.
In industrial environments, emissions and identifier behavior can reveal vendor choices, system layout, or operational cadence, which can be valuable reconnaissance for a motivated adversary. In access control scenarios, a badge identifier that appears in clear form can become a proxy for someone's movement and routine. The important concept is that unintended data exposure is still exposure, and exposure enables targeting, timing, and social engineering.
Because these systems often influence physical access or operational continuity, a safe assessment posture is not optional. It is part of professional competence.
The safest starting point is to observe first, learning how the system behaves under normal conditions, and documenting what signals exist without disrupting operations. When actions beyond observation are necessary, they should be coordinated with authorized stakeholders and bounded by clear constraints that reflect safety and uptime priorities.
A disciplined approach favors low-impact validation, controlled windows, and careful documentation that demonstrates risk without escalating beyond what is needed. This is where good assessment looks more like careful engineering than like adversarial theatrics. On an exam and in the field, the ability to articulate safe, authorized evaluation is a mark of maturity.
Now, consider a scenario where a badge system uses RFID but relies on weak verification, treating a static identifier as sufficient proof to unlock a door. The system may appear secure because it has a reader, logs badge reads, and enforces an access decision at a physical boundary. The weakness is that if the identifier is readable and reproducible, an attacker can duplicate the badge signal and present it successfully without any additional challenge. If the design lacks cryptographic challenge response, secondary verification, or anomaly detection for suspicious reuse, the control is effectively trusting something that can be copied. The practical impact is not limited to a single doorway, because physical entry can enable workstation access, network access, and proximity to other sensitive areas. This is a strong example of how a simple identity signal can become a high-impact weakness when the system equates presented value with verified identity.
In that badge scenario, the most meaningful assessment outcome is a clear description of what is being trusted and what is missing in the verification path. If the system never proves freshness, then replay becomes plausible, and the attacker does not need to break cryptography because there may be no cryptography to break. If the system does not bind the credential to a device property, user action, or secure element, then cloning becomes a practical impersonation technique. If monitoring is absent, then repeated use of the same identifier across unusual times or locations may go unnoticed, which increases the attacker's room to maneuver. The value of this finding comes from connecting a technical weakness to a credible path to physical entry and downstream compromise.
When you express it that way, stakeholders understand why the weakness matters without needing to be protocol experts.
A second scenario highlights Bluetooth privacy leakage, where devices broadcast names that reveal sensitive context, even if no one connects to them. Organizations sometimes name devices for convenience, using labels that include department names, roles, locations, or operational purpose. When those devices remain discoverable, anyone nearby can scan and infer internal structure, sensitive activities, or where critical functions are performed. Even if encryption is strong, the broadcast metadata can still leak valuable information because it is shared before any secure connection is established. That information can feed social engineering, physical targeting, or simply help an adversary map an environment over time. This scenario is powerful because it shows how non-secret information becomes dangerous when it gives an attacker clarity and confidence about where to focus. Mitigation concepts across these systems tend to revolve around stronger authentication, appropriate encryption, and reduced discoverability, but the exact emphasis depends on the technology and operational constraints.
For NFC and RFID, stronger authentication generally means moving away from trusting static identifiers and toward verification methods that prove legitimacy and freshness, making cloning and replay materially harder. Encryption helps when it protects the meaningful parts of the exchange and is paired with correct key management and verification, not just enabled as a checkbox.
For Bluetooth, secure pairing policies and limiting discovery reduce the opportunity for casual scanning, spoofing, and opportunistic connections.
In OT environments, mitigation often leans on segmentation, controlled access, monitoring, and change management discipline, because device-level hardening may be constrained.
The common thread is to reduce what is broadcast, reduce what is trusted without verification, and increase the attacker's cost without destabilizing operations. A classic pitfall is assuming consumer device rules apply cleanly to industrial environments, which can lead to unrealistic recommendations and unsafe testing behavior. Consumer guidance often presumes frequent patching, easy replacement, and the ability to reboot or reconfigure devices without cascading effects, and those assumptions are frequently false in OT.
Industrial devices may be validated for specific configurations, supported only under strict vendor conditions, and integrated into processes where change can produce unexpected behavior.
Another mistake is underestimating the complexity of dependencies, because a single device may be part of a control loop with timing and safety characteristics that are not obvious from a network diagram. If you approach these environments with a default enterprise IT mindset, you may either miss the real risk or recommend changes that introduce operational hazards. A mature assessment respects the environment's purpose while still identifying where security improvements are feasible and impactful.
Quick wins are still available, and they often come from reducing exposure rather than requiring a full redesign of the technology stack.
Disabling unused radios is a practical step because an inactive interface cannot be discovered, paired with, or abused, and it also reduces incidental emissions that support reconnaissance.
Enforcing secure pairing policies for Bluetooth devices can produce immediate benefit, especially when combined with reduced discoverability and less revealing naming conventions. For badge systems, improvements can include tighter monitoring, better anomaly detection, and procedural safeguards when cryptographic upgrades are not immediately possible. In OT contexts, segmentation in strict access pathways often provides significant risk reduction without touching fragile endpoints.
The value of quick wins is that they respect constraints while still narrowing the attacker's options.
To make the core ideas stick, keep a simple memory phrase in mind: constraints, identity signals, pairing, replay, control. Constraints reminds you that safety, uptime, and operational discipline shape both the threat model and the acceptable assessment approach. Identity signals anchors NFC and RFID as mechanisms that often present data that systems treat as trust, which becomes risky when the data is static or weakly verified.
Pairing keeps your attention on Bluetooth trust establishment, where weak pairing can undermine encryption and enable spoofing or unauthorized connections.
Replay reminds you to look for missing freshness checks, because repeating a valid interaction can be as powerful as stealing a credential outright. Control closes the loop by reminding you these technologies often gate physical or operational outcomes, so the impact profile can be immediate and serious.
As we conclude episode 82, the key is to keep system differences clear so your actions remain safe, authorized, and appropriate to each environment.
For OT, a safe action is to prioritize observation and coordination, validating risk in a way that protects safety and uptime rather than pushing disruptive tests. For NFC, a safe action is to evaluate whether access decisions rely on static identifiers or whether verification includes freshness and authentication that resists cloning and replay. For RFID, a safe action is to assess how badges are verified and how misuse could translate into physical entry and broader compromise, documenting impact without escalating beyond authorization. For Bluetooth, a safe action is to review discoverability, pairing strength, and naming practices to reduce spoofing and privacy leakage while preserving necessary functionality.
When you can name one safe, justified action for each type, you demonstrate the disciplined reasoning Pen Test Plus expects and real-world environments demand. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.